is also another example of sort of the movement in this arena is just being involved in those meetings and seeing the formation of a transgender group at Grand Valley. So then you think back to a time when there really was no support, no organizational support for even an LGBT group.
Right.
And now having come far enough to have groups for transgender people who, unfortunately, in the early days of the movement here, really were not a very visible part of the community, of the LGBT community. And now that I've seen recently in the network newsletters that there are a couple of transgender groups also that are functioning within the network. So I think it's interesting to see how with this development in the community, really more and more sectors of the community finding a place, becoming more visible, having a voice.
I mean, it's been very interesting and in many ways very encouraging to sort of hear about this sort of evolution. I'm wondering how important you think it is, and again, this is sort of just from perspective of several decades of seeing the difference between, somebody who was maybe just beginning to kind of think about and come to terms with their own identity 30 years ago, and then somebody who is now, the difference that a place like the LGBT Resource Center can make in helping to facilitate that point in their lives. But just, what importance does it play, do you think, in the role of students at a place like Grand Valley to have that kind of resource in place?
I think that's huge. I think it's huge for students as well as faculty and staff. In terms of people's sense of well-being, their ability to feel that they're part of an organization, truly a part of an organization, valued for who they are, and also I think that people can more productively engage, whether as a faculty or staff person or a student, when they feel that there is support for them, when they don't have to put out a lot of energy for protecting their identity or dealing with uncertainties about what they can say to whom and where. I think that resource center is a very important, when the network still plays an important role. Probably very different now than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but
Sure.
Still a really important role.
Yeah. Not long ago, I had finished a book by Vicki Eckler called Queer America, which is sort of a people's history of LGBT community in the United States, which was very interesting and helpful in terms of what we're trying to do here. But one thing she identifies that has been sort of a source of attention, if you will, particularly maybe since Stonewall, has been kind of this, people who are maybe more interested in kind of an assimilationist approach of just sort of trying to be accepted and included in the community, and other folks who are saying that are more about, this is more about liberation, and we're not wanting to just be tolerated or, accepted kind of thing. And I'm just sort of wondering if that's, if you have anything to say about sort of that dynamic, and maybe how that's manifested in Grand Rapids, if at all.
Just the thought I have about that is that this is a very large and diverse community, and people are in many different places in the spectrum. And even in terms of how important their identity is to them, on a daily basis, or just overall how, just what role that plays in their lives.
Right.
So I think that, for example, that in the days when we were campaigning for the ordinance, there were definitely conflicts about, is this the right time? dynamics between people feeling like you had to move more slowly and those who were pushing forward. And I think, fortunately, we had enough people who really were those visionaries
Mm-hmm.
in moving it forward that happened. But I think that is always a tension
Mm-hmm.
between the people who really want to move things forward and those who feel like now is not the right time. And,
Yeah. Yeah. We were talking for another sort of set of interviews with Michael Johnston, who's kind of a labor historian for Grand Rapids, and sort of refers to Grand Rapids as sort of a bellwether for the nation in some ways. That this is like even marketers do test marketing in Grand Rapids to see how Grand Rapids would respond to products and so forth. But I'm just wondering what you think about where Grand Rapids is in terms of the rest of the country on maybe issues, but also just historically, like in terms of looking at when Stonewall happened, or the AIDS crisis of the '80s, or marriage equality, or don't ask, don't tell, or those kind of things. Do you think Grand Rapids is sort of more or less reflective of the rest of the country in terms of where the general community is at in terms of coming to terms with LGBT issues? Do you think we're ahead of the curve, behind the curve? I mean, do you have any sense of?
in some ways, I wonder if we aren't ahead of the curve possibly for Midwestern cities. Certainly ahead of the curve probably in terms of southern communities. And also I think it varies from one issue or sort of one aspect of these issues to another. So the fact that we had an ordinance early on, and also that we had so much activism in the community early on, I think does in some ways set Grand Rapids apart.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we now have the resource center at Grand Valley, I don't know how many universities have those. So I think that there are definitely areas in which Grand Rapids has been a bit ahead of the curve. And also one of the things that I see now is that many of the religious groups now are really taking a far different tact on LGBTQ issues now than they were earlier on. So even when we have some very prominent people from the religious community, being very supportive of the LGBT community,
Mm-hmm.
that certainly is very different from what was happening 30 years ago. Not that there weren't some members of that community that were playing leadership roles, but
Yep.
it's a different. It certainly permeated the religious community much more over the last couple of decades.
Yeah. Well, we're sort of hoping that this project, has some longevity, and sort of thinking about if, people who are looking at this issue 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, looking at listening to these interviews, we've just been asking people if they had thoughts about, thinking of maybe a high school student or something this was part of a class or something, what message might you want to sort of pass on to young folks 30, 40 years down the road, in terms of thinking about, this history and why it's important to recognize it in terms of wherever they're going to be, a few decades down the road. I'm just wondering, if there's any, what might you say if you're there thinking like, if I had an opportunity to sort of address those folks,
What I think of is the kind of movement in terms of the LGBTQ community, as well as women's rights and what has happened in terms of people of color, and the distance we've come in all of those areas over the last 30 years or so, and also that we still have a long way to go. And how important it is that we sort of see where we've come from in order to put where we are now in perspective, and also to recognize that that whole idea that changes in these issues have come about because of kind of ordinary people being involved and acting with passion, and many people acting with a great deal of courage on these issues, that these changes have not come about because there were just a couple of people who had some extraordinary talents or capabilities or bravery. That really the progress is a result of many, many people, each working in whatever way they were able to move things forward.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's very exciting work to be involved in.
Mm-hmm.
To feel a part of making significant change.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as you know, we've been doing this. Gerb and I always say every time, after every interview, it's sort of like, wow, we feel pretty privileged and honored to kind of hearing all these stories and all that information and that history, and certainly how important it is, because we often forget about what that has meant, what people have done. And so we're certainly learning all this as we're sort of going through this process. So it's been really great to do this, and so we hope that we're going to continue to sort of do justice to this aspect of this people's history for Grand Rapids.
I love the fact that you're doing the videos.
Yeah.
So somebody is not going to have to pick up a book and read a lengthy book about this, but so we'll actually have that visual and audio record of this in a way that, from what you've described, is going to be very accessible.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's terrific.
Yeah. I didn't really have any other questions, but if there's things that we haven't addressed that you think are important to bring up, Dottie, I mean, the floor is yours if there's something you wanted to speak to.
I think one of the things that has always struck me is just the diversity of the LGBTQ community, and how, for example, when you hear people's coming out stories, that there are just so many different ways that people arrive at being part of this community. And it's a great reminder about what assumptions we may make, or and it's just very important to look at all the different ways that people become part of various communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Yeah. Certainly have seen that in all the interviews.
Mm-hmm.
We interviewed somebody yesterday who came out at 75,
Amazing.
like, wow,
Amazing.
so yeah,
That's fabulous.
yeah.
That is terrific.
So yeah. He's in his 80s now and he's still
Wow.
moving forward.
Wow.
So so yeah. And then we've been interviewing students, who have had a very interesting take on it.
Mm-hmm.
College students who even the language that they're using is much different. Using terms like gender variant and just
Mm-hmm.
like don't want to be stuck in don't want to be labeled, don't want to be sort of stuck in a box. It's been very inspiring.
Yeah. One of the things that in my own experience, for me, the process of coming, I grew up in a small town, really was totally not connected at all with lesbian and gay issues until I was well into my 30s. And many of the people that I initially met felt that, from the time they were very young, they experienced a great deal of conflict over identity issues. And for me, it was not at all that situation. For me, it was a matter of having, meeting people in the lesbian and gay community at a certain point in my 30s, and as a result of that, realizing that I was open to a relationship with a woman and then falling in love with a woman. So a very different experience than someone who has, from a very young age, dealt with a lot of conflict over identity issues.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just fascinating to
Mm-hmm.
see all the different ways that we
Yeah.
come to this.
Yeah. Well, great. We really appreciate you coming down and speaking with us and sharing your story. So.
And I really appreciate the work that you all are doing on this, and can't wait to see it.
Yeah. Okay.